In Ois Gimel, the Rebbe brings a Tosfos in which we see clearly that a cotton has no connection to the first Korban Pesach. Unlike Reb Chaim and the Ragachover are trying to say that there is a connection, according to Reb Chaim, if the father is memane, he's minatoyre monui, and according to the Ragachover, lechatchila, you could be memane, but you don't have to be memane. But in Tosfos, we see clearly that a cotton has really no connection. And the Alter Rebbe buys into the idea of Tosfos. Also, he passes brings it down the Shulchan Aruch. Let's look inside Gimel. Aber the Tirutz, this answer, as a fila loitem man the Omar Selebesovas Leidorais. Even if we say that Selebesovas, that the Shaykhis Dal cotton is not from the Torah, which means that min Torah, the cotton is not part of the Korban Pesach. But we wanted to say that Reb Chaim and the Ragachover wanted to say is that cotton begeder minu min HaTorah, but he's still in the boundaries of minu min HaTorah. Again, according to Reb Chaim, who says you could, after, if you mamane him, you're not obligated to be mamane him, but if you mamane, it becomes a chelik of it. And according to the Ragachover, you have a choice either to be mamane him or to just have him as a family member. So they say that even if we say that Sela Beisovas is Lavdi Eraisis, Naminat Torah, it's still, there is some connection. The Rebbe says it's Deirish Birus Neisov. We need to explain this further because we see very clearly, seemingly, that in Tosfos that it's not like that. Tosfos zogt, Tosfos says, as Leuten man de Omar Sela Beisovas Lavdi Eraisa, that if we say Sela Beisovas is not from the Torah, is the Korban Pesach Adavar Isur Fardem Cotton. That the Korban Pesach is an item which is prohibited for the cotton. Let alone that it can be money or anything else, because it's also for the cotton. While the Tosfos argues, while the Korban Pesach Tornit Gigessen Werden Shalolim Nuyev. Korban Pesach is prohibited to be eaten if you didn't count on him. And since the cotton cannot be counted, so therefore it's going to be an Isur. If it's an Isur, how can we give a cotton to eat for the Korban Pesach? Und das, was men meg Michael sein dem cotton from Korban Pesach, the fact that you are allowed to feed the cotton the minder from the Korban Pesach is not the far was iko chinuch mitzvah, because the education to a mitzvah basically overrides this prohibition. Das heißt, what does this mean? As loit Tosfos, that according to Tosfos, the way Tosfos learned, is a cotton, which is the halacha. According to the one that says it's not minat Torah, nit begeder minui. He's not in the boundaries. You can't even appoint him. In other words, nit nor and is nit begeder chiyuv is not only that he's not obligated. Tosfos says nor it is asur bozeh. He's prohibited. Tosfos says nit begeder hakorban. He's not in the boundaries of eating this korban. Minat Torah is asur imafilu Michael's right for korban pesach. From the Torah, it's prohibited even to feed him the korban pesach. No distinction, this case or the other case. It seems it's asur minat Torah to feed a korban, a pesach, to the cotton, to the minor. Let alone being allowed under Alter Rebbe, this halacha that Tosfos concludes that even something which is asur min haTorah, but we see by Korban Pesach that the mitzvah of chinuch, which is midrabanan, overrides the prohibition of the Torah. But not to go into midrabanan, but the bottom line is, if there is a chinuch mitzvah, you can give him even an isur. Even an isur you can give him because of the mitzvah of chinuch. Und der Alter Rebbe bringt darauf, Shittas HaTois Halacha. The Alter Rebbe brings it down Halacha. V'zel l'shein. And the Alter Rebbe brings down like this, that kol davar shu mishum chinuch mitzvah, anything which is education for a mitzvah. And we're talking about a minor. We're trying to educate him. Muter lisfes loy isur b'yadayim. You can actually give him that things which is prohibited with your hands directly. Not only he should take it himself, let the cotton eat himself. You can give it to him, which normally would be prohibited to give an isur to a cotton. There's one thing if it takes it himself, whether you have to stop him, but to give an isur to a cotton, then you're not allowed to. But if there's a chinuch mitzvah, says the Alter Rebbe, you're allowed to give it. Going as for example, to give the cotton the korban pesach, that there is a chinuch there. He's already of age of education. Even though he was not counted, he's not part of it. And the pesach is not eaten but to those who are counted. So basically, for him to eat from the korban pesach is an isur, and yet, because of chinuch, you're allowed to give the cotton. You're allowed to give him the korban pesach. Since your intention is to educate him with the mitzvah, it's okay for you to feed him the isur because you want him to eat the korban pesach, to educate him, because all Yidden are eating. He's not mechuyev, but he should be educated as well, even though there's an isur to eat something which is not counted on. Was there mocker from them dinis? Where does the Alter Rebbe get this halacha? Is from Mogen Avram. So the Mogen Avram, welche bringt us from Toys Anal, which brings from this Toysus. Because this Toysus says, how are you allowed to feed the cotton, the korban pesach? And he says, because it's chinuch, and because of chinuch, you can feed the isur. But according to the explanation of the Rambam, it will turn out, according to them, they say that there is no isur feeding the korban pesach. They explain the Rambam. Why does the Rambam say that if the cotton made the first pesach, he doesn't have to make the second pesach? Because they say that the cotton can eat the korban pesach. It's not an isur for the korban pesach, and therefore, when the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe it turned out, as the psak von Alter Rebbe gedas Toysvis, when the Alter Rebbe rules like the Toysvis, and he says that there is no gather of minui for a cotton by korban pesach, is bestiret zum psak Rambam, is contradicting to the ruling of the Rambam, because it should be that according to the Alter Rebbe, according to Toysvis, that if the cotton even brought a korban pesach on the Pesach Rishon, he still should have to bring the second Pesach, because the korban rishon is not shaykh to the korban rishon. That's an isur. That's something which, for chinuch, we're allowing it, but there is no permissible way to do it. So, according to the Alter Rebbe and Tosfos, it should be that you should not be yotzer. The cotton is not yotzer the Pesach rishon. You have to make a Pesach sheni. But we don't find anybody arguing. We don't find a dissenting opinion, a disagreement on the Rambam. Looks like everybody holds that you would still have to make the korban pesach, the second Pesach. You would have to make it I mean, you don't have to make it. The Rambam rules you don't have to make it. But why, according to the Alter Rebbe, l'cheri, you should make it because the korban pesach that the cotton brought was actually an isur. It was a prohibition. The fact that the commentaries of the Rambam don't express that there is a dissent is moving as alle nemen on psak Rambam. So it's understood that everybody accepts the ruling of the Rambam that he does not have to bring the korban sheni, pesach sheni, if he brought the korban rishon. So, but then the question is why? So all the answers that we gave that the cotton is shaykh to the pesach rishon, like Rabbi Chaim and like the Rogatchover, but in the Alter Rebbe from Tosfos comes out clear that they're not shaykh to it, and the only reason we give them is for the mitzvah of chinuch. But here we have to caution. The Rebbe takes it aside to explain the wording of the Alter Rebbe's lashon. It almost seems in the Alter Rebbe's lashon that in Tosfos it doesn't say that. In Tosfos it says bepashtus that it's an isur. The Alter Rebbe says, qualifies. He says, why is it an isur for the cotton? He doesn't say because the cotton is not shaykhs to the korban. Because Tosfos says it's a dvar isur for cotton across the board. There's no distinction. In the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe live, you look the lashon, it almost seems that the Alter Rebbe says the reason why he's not shaykh is because you didn't count him on it. That makes it to the Isur. The Alter Rebbe writes Le'nimna olav. So it seems very clearly that if he did actually count, on the contrary, then he would be shaykh to the korban. That works according to Rabbi Chaim or works according to the Rogatchover. In our case, because there's an Isur, then it's okay. And the Rebbe said, this is not, you can't say that. We have to figure out the language. The Rebbe is going to explain the language of the Alter Rebbe, but the Rebbe says you can't say that according to the Alter Rebbe, has a shaykhus. The Tosfos holds he has no connection at all, but the Alter Rebbe says the only reason why the Alter Rebbe says he has no shaykhus to korban pesach the cotton is because you didn't count him in this case. But if you counted him, he would have, and he would count him. Can't say that in the Alter Rebbe. Because the whole basis, as the Rebbe will explain later on, the whole basis that you can do a mitzvah that Tosfos comes up with, that you can do a mitzvah of chinuch for a cotton, even though it's an isur, you can still do it because of chinuch, is based on the notion that we see that we give a korban pesach. How do you give the korban pesach? So we have to conclude that it's because of chinuch. This overrides it. That's the source of Tosfos, and that's the halacha the Alter Rebbe says that chinuch overrides the isur. But if we should say that the Alter Rebbe also holds that chinuch is that there is a connection from the cotton to the korban pesach, and the only reason why in this case that the Alter Rebbe gives the example is because they didn't count the cotton in. So how does the Alter Rebbe know that we can give him a chinuch even because of chinuch even when there's an isur? Maybe the reason you give him, you feed him when there is no isur, when you counted him. So the whole basis is based of the Tosfos is on the idea that you can't count him, that he's not shaykhus to it, like Tosfos says at all. But if he would be shaykhus to the minui, then we don't have evidence to the halacha. The Alter Rebbe wouldn't paskin that he can override the isur when chinuch because there is not necessarily an isur. So we have to explain the language why the Alter Rebbe uses that they didn't count on him. So simply the Rebbe says they didn't count him and he can't be counted. And the Rebbe will bring another explanation. Dala. That's the Rebbe going to discuss now. L'chayre wollt men as gekent verenteren. L'chayre, you could answer this apidiu chaloshen from Mogen Avrom and Alten Rebbe by the precise language of the Mogen Avrom, the Alten Rebbe. The Alten Rebbe writes, "Muter lispes loy isur yadayim." You're allowed to give him the isur by hand. You're going lahachil pesach lekot to feed, give him the pesach lekot. And the Alter Rebbe writes, "Afal pisha nimna olav," even though you haven't counted him on the korban pesach. This implies you didn't count him. You could count him, then he would. But the Alter Rebbe says, even though you didn't count him, and because you didn't count him, so he's not really allowed to. It's an isur, and yet you're feeding him. So it seems that it's an isur. So the Alter Rebbe almost seems like we look at the Loshen. The Alter Rebbe almost seems to say that he is Sichos when you are meina him, and the only reason because he's not nimna. But the Rebbe says you can't say that. But the Loshen afal pishale nimna olav unit she'ene bar minuit. It says that he wasn't counted. The Alter Rebbe doesn't say because you can't count him. Is mashki is mashma. So this appears to say as oich ba cotton is shaykh together for minute. That also by cotton there is to the definition to be count the cotton. Now is as achilas dvar isur. So why is it osur here? Because we're talking about that learning. That's why the isur. The isur is, but this itself is the reason why he is. It's an issue for him because he didn't count it. So if we said that, so we can say that there's a difference between the Alter Rebbe basically and Tosfos. That Tosfos says there's no minui. The Alter Rebbe says is because loy nimna olav, that you can't count. You didn't, but you could technically count it. Similar to Rabbi Chaim and the Ragachover. Apizevot melechayrik you can't. So as the Alter Rebbe, that's what we say. The Alter Rebbe nemt on divra Tosfos blois lenegeli inachinuch. He accepted lahalocha. The Tosfos concludes because Tosfos says that there is no way to be mimane. There's a cotton is not together of the korban pesach at all. So the Alter Rebbe and therefore Tosfos concludes that you can, because of chinuch, you're allowed to. That's how we feed the cotton. Tosfos, the Alter Rebbe accepts that conclusion of Tosfos, but not the opinion of Tosfos. Nemton divra Tosfos blois benegeli in a chinuch. As mitzad chinuch mitzvah, Tosfos conclusion that chinuch mitzvah megman Michael sein the korban pesach tzakotn, that you're allowed to feed the korban pesach miner afilu when there's haste by madvar isur, even when it's called by him madvar isur, like Tosfos says. But what is the isur? So that's a difference between the way Tosfos. Tosfos says it's not together, so it's not going to help minui. According to the Alter Rebbe, the isur because you didn't count them. Ober der isur thereby is not vitas Tosfos. The Alter Rebbe's the isur is not the pian of Tosfos. As it balds lebase of is the lav der Eise that since Lebo is not min Torah cotton bechlal mitas of korban pesach, then a minor is not allowed, not permitted to eat at all from korban pesach. That's Tosfos' opinion. That's not what the Alter Rebbe holds. Nor, Alter Rebbe says when this halacha that he's giving an example from a korban pesach cotton is not because a cotton cannot be part of it, but baldor retman in a foul, then loinim no it didn't count. If he did count the minor on his pesach, Meg is allowed to darf der cotton es from korban pesach man ha-Torah, then he can eat from ha-Torah. While is einer from the Bnei HaChabura, because he's one of the group. So basically, if we learn so in the Alter Rebbe, that that he is part of it, if you can count him, but the only reason the Alter Rebbe says there's an Isser over here is because the Poili didn't count him, and yet you're allowed to give him because of Chinuch Mitzvah, because of Tosfos' conclusion, even though Tosfos concludes that, because according to Tosfos, you can't be mamana him at all, whether you want or not. He's not in the get of Korban Pesach at all. Ulifizeh is the Psak von Alten Rebbe nicht bestiert zum Psak Rambam. So it turns out that the Alten Rebbe's ruling is not contradict the ruling of the Rambam. Well, the Rambam read Kinal in Afal v'Nimnolo. The Rambam, as we said before, is talking about when you counted, and you could count him min haTorah on the Korban Pesach. And Meli was Yotze, and Bemeli doesn't have to bring the second Korban Pesach. Mashenkin the Alter Rebbe read in Afal v'Nimnolo. He talks about a case when you did not count on the Korban Pesach. The father did not include the cut in the Korban Pesach. And that's why there's an Isser. And that's the Diuk Loshen Le'nimnol. So that way, we would be able to say at least that the Alter Rebbe does not contradict the halach of the Rambam, that if you brought the cotton was counted on the Pesach Rishon, he doesn't have to bring the Pesach Sheni because he was already fulfilled his obligation. But the Rebbe says we can't say that. We can't say that that's the pshat in the Alter Rebbe. Because how do we know that mitzvah's chinuch overrides the isur that you're allowed because of mitzvah's chinuch you're allowed to do it? It's only because of the fact that we give him the Korban Pesach. Otherwise, why would you give him a Korban Pesach? But if we say if he's a money, we're allowed to give him the Korban Pesach. So what's the question? How do you give him the Korban Pesach? So how do we know the halacha? So we have to explain what the Alter Rebbe's words mean differently, not the way we explain. Hey, aber kat daikis, but when you look into his kenman nitzogen azoi, you cannot possibly say so. As Leut and Psak von Alten Rebbe is not together for minibakot, that according to the ruling of Alter Rebbe, there is something to that you can appoint, you can give count the kot. Warum the Mocker as not matter given to Michael sein, a cotton for Korban Pesach. What is the source that you allowed to give him cotton for Korban Pesach? Where do we know that from? So the Alter Rebbe is talking about you didn't count him, but for chinuch mitzvah. How do we know that? Is doch von Divrei Toysa. That's from Toysa now. Is be shloima loy shitas at Toysa. So Toysa, we understand how Toysa knows that you overrides the mitzvah. Chinuch overrides the isur that for the cotton, because there's no other way. Or else, how do we feed a cotton the cotton Pesach? Is bishleim l'shitas ha'toisves as a cotton is neat. That a cotton is neat together. You cannot point is memuchrich zu sagen. So then we have no choice, but we have to say as mehodos matir given mitzad chinuch mitzvah that they permitted it because of education mitzvah. Kedei verantworten the kushya from toisves because that is necessary, because otherwise we have toisves problem. How could you feed a Pesach when it weren't counted? So we have to say mitzvah chinuch overrides, but that's only according to Tosfos that there's no way to feed the cotton, because he says it's always usur. He's not whether you want to count or not. You can't count the cotton, so that's how you know. And still, we find that you feed him. How do we feed him? We have to say that the mitzvah chinuch overrides it. But if but if we hold that Minat Torah, he is part of being counting and eating the Pesach, if we're going to explain in the Alter Rebbe, only because loy nimne, but he could be counted. So from where can we say that if he did not count him, how do we know that we can actually, with your hands, go feed him? To give him an issue because of chinuch mitzvah. You didn't count him. Why should you give him? How do we know to do that? You had a way of including him by being a money. According to the Alter Rebbe's ruling, as lispes lo osur biyadayim osur l'chol odom min haTorah. To actually give in hands, there's one thing of chinuch from the parents that have to educate the son, but any person is not allowed to. Anybody from the Torah is not allowed to. So it turns out, kumtuis as that heter lahachila mitam chinuch mitzvah. This allowance to allow for chinuch mitzvah, but chinuch is a mitzvah b'divrei sofrim. Is a mitzvah of sofrim. Is doichan isur min haTorah. It overrides an Isur min HaTorah. So how do we know that? From the fact that we gave him the Korban Pesach, because you should count him and then he'll be able to eat it like anybody else. Why should we say that chinuch mitzvah should override a mitzvah min HaTorah when you can count him? So you didn't count him? Okay, so then don't give it to him. It's like something like by an adult who didn't count. So therefore, we have to say if we rule like the Alter Rebbe rules that you're allowed to feed him because of a chinuch, that means to say there's no way that the father can give him to eat from the Korban Pesach. He can't be memana him only because of chinuch mitzvah. We allowing it. Darf man sagen. As levov, as leuten psak von Alten Rebbe is men HaTorah nitokin din minu efakot. According to the ruling of the Alter Rebbe, there is no such a thing to appoint a cotton. Otherwise, you would not be allowed to give him the Korban Pesach. If there was a way for him to be memana him, he would be not allowed to go give him. The Alter Rebbe seems to say that because not this is labdavke that Alter Rebbe Loshen is not to be understood the way we understood it. That the reason the cotton is not part of the Korban Pesach is because you didn't count him. To deduce from this to learn that he could have been counted. No, that's not the way to learn this. What it means, even though you didn't count him, and even if you counted him, it wouldn't help. It's the first one. Darf man so again, as Leute sagt man Alten Rebbe is min HaTorah nitokin din minu efakot, that according to the rule of the Alter Rebbe min HaTorah, there is no such a thing as appointing a cotton. Und das was der Alter Rebbe sagt dem Loschen Afapischle in Imnolov, and he says even though he didn't count on it, und nicht shane about a minute, it didn't say because you can't count it. It just says it looks like because the poil didn't count it. Okay, it's by but Madafim Farzan Kavanosei, so we have to explain what he meant is Aleph. We have to explain. So Rebbe gives a few explanations. First of all, as with dem Loschle Nimna, that he was gone Meinter Zogen, as der cotton wird nicht nimna olav. That he wasn't counted, meaning it's not that they didn't actually count it, but that he cannot be counted. This says, afilu oib der avot imeni given ala Pesach, even if the father did count on Pesach, is loy nimna. He's not counted, and he's not together minui. So this is what it means. So the lotion doesn't mean, as you understood it, that just because he didn't mine it, but you can actually mine it. So this is the pashtus the lotion. And the Rebbe gives here another interpretation to explain the language of the Alter Rebbe that it says Afa Pish Lenim. So the Rebbe, there's no question that according to the Alter Rebbe, a cotton cannot be counted at all. Unlike the explanation of the Tzopnas Paneach or the explanation of the Rabbi Chaim, a cotton cannot be named. No, the Rebbe will have to explain. Then why is it that if he brought the Korban Pesach, he doesn't have to bring that? We'll learn next sif. But now we're just dealing with the language of the Alter Rebbe, which seems to imply that the only reason why it's an Isser is because they didn't count him, but he could be counted technically. The Rebbe says, the Rebbe explains the language here. No, that's not the case. But it means because you didn't count him. As the Ravotim nit meinigran, not that he cannot be counted, but Itaka didn't count him. He didn't include him in the count for the Korban Pesach. So why do we have to say he didn't count him? He's not. You can't count him. Why does the Alter Rebbe say that the Isser is because you didn't count him in as part of the group? It doesn't help whether you count him or not. So why does the Alter Rebbe say he didn't count him? But then there would have been an idea. Maybe one would think, as so maybe there would be a svore that you should count him. because you want a chinuch, so I have to count him, b'chdei zu meichel sein from Korban Pesach. So, in order to eat from the Korban Pesach. And the Alter Rebbe is coming to tell us, you know, even though he wasn't counted, and the counting then would have been a chinuch counting, und das kommt der Alter Rebbe Schöle sein. And that's what the Rebbe is coming to negate. Af al pi shaloi nimna olav, even though he didn't count him. And he didn't even count him with the Rabbanim. It's at chinuch he didn't count him. Megwin im Michael sein from Korban Pesach, you can still give him the Korban Pesach. So the Alter Rebbe wants to tell us a chiddush, not only because he cannot be counted from the Torah, but even though that he wasn't counted mitzad chinuch mitzvah, and still we can give him the Korban Pesach. What would help the counting? The Rebbe explains the Bir Bazeh. Gleich noch dem din hanal benegel Korban Pesach, immediately in Shulchan Aruch after din as it pertains to Korban Pesach, is the Alter Rebbe mamshich. The Alter Rebbe continues. Avol mitzvah shaloi shayich bo chinuch, a mitzvah which education doesn't apply to it. The hainu that he won't be able to do it when he becomes an adult. Even though it's for the purpose of a mitzvah. And therefore, since when he becomes an adult, you are not going to be allowed to do it anyway, so now it's also awesome. When do we allow because of chinuch is something that he can do when he's an adult? Rebbe explains, high time for that reason. And for is, so there are such opinions. As benitten the dan, in our case of the Korban Pesach, we bald as a godel tornit essen from Korban Pesach b'liminui. An adult is not allowed to eat Korban Pesach b'liminui. So, what's going to help since the cotton is not you can't be memane him? So it turns out that he's eating something which he can't do when he's an adult, because as an adult he can't eat b'liminui. The balda godel tornit essen from Korban Pesach b'liminui is euch der heter mitam chinuch mitzvah. So when are we allowed to give it to him because chinuch mitzvah? Nor in a fall when avivot given, if his father counted it. Because if the father didn't count him and the father didn't make him part of the Korban Pesach, he should not be allowed to eat his father should not be allowed to give him the Korban Pesach now. Of chinuch, it's not chinuch, because chinuch means that when he's an adult he can do it, but he can't do so as an adult if he wasn't counted, because an adult not counted can't eat it. So why should we be allowed to give it to him? So we're talking not allowed. So this is what Alter Rebbe is saying. No, he disagrees. That even if you did not memane him, meaning that he's not even chinuch mitzvah, and still you can give it to him. Or the boy in the bracket, or the boy say this a little differently. As would given as sal kedaitoch, there would be a thought. As when is man doiche dem isur min hatoira lispus loy biyadayim. When will we push away, override against giving the isur, the Korban Pesach, to the cotton directly to chinuch mitzvah, because your education was his norm divrei suffering, which is only with Rabbanon. It's only if the act of the father is full. He counted him, but he also pointed him, that he made him memane him also. That he includes the cotton through minas para Pesach. So there is a thought to say that maybe in this case the cotton is counted. Is only counted. And the Alter Rebbe is trying to say, no, that's not true. That even though you didn't count on him, so it's not chinuch b'shleimus. and uh, and even though he's an adult, he would not allow to be eat like that, and still you could give it to the cotton. As of the Alter Rebbe, as Ava Pishlei Nimnolov, Meger Michael sein, dem cotton zu lieben. Okay. So therefore, so since we concluded now that the Alter Rebbe really holds that a cotton has no business to minu at all, not through his father, not by himself. There's not whether uh, he wants to make him part of it, like the Rabbi Chaim says, or like the Ragachover says that he could. The Alter Rebbe says you can't do it at all, because otherwise you would not. If there's a way of doing it, you would not be allowed to displace it by Yadayim. So therefore, is other kushleluchta vishtin the psak von Alter Rebbe that he's not together with psak Rambam with the Rambam. The Rambam rules that if he did the first Pesach, he doesn't have to bring the Korban Pesach, the minor. But the minor doing the first Pesach, it didn't do anything over here. So why shouldn't it's a mitzvah of Atzmai? So he should have to make the second Korban Pesach. That's what it looks. So how does the Alter Rebbe's view fit with what the Rambam's rules?